I searched the nitty gritty, gross rounds of 2025 fantasy football mock drafts and best ball drafts to find you guys some of the best overall sleepers heading into the 2025 fantasy football season. These are not pretty selections. They're not going to feel great, but these guys might just end up having some solid value as we approach the upcoming fantasy year. All right, let's start the video off with sophomore wide receiver Jaylen McDaniel of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, currently sitting at an ADP of 138.1 on Sleeper and going as late as the 13th round on Underdog Fantasy. This is a player who obviously had a bit of an emergence last year in his rookie campaign, late in the season after the injury to Chris Godwin and when Mike Evans was back on the field. I mean, we saw Jaylen McDaniel truly become a kind of waiver wire league winner type player last year. 21.9 fantasy points in week 14. 18.5 in week 15, 16.7 in week 16, and 23 in week 17. And then, we did see involvement out of Jaylen McDaniel in weeks 18 and then into the playoffs for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers as well. Overall, averaged 10.4 fantasy points per game and had 8 total touchdowns in his rookie season. 7 of those 8 touchdowns came in those final weeks that we just talked about. He had a touchdown in week 1 against Washington as well. So obviously, there's a lot of reasons why Jaylen McDaniel is not going earlier in drafts and mock drafts right now. We are going to have presumably a healthy Chris Godwin coming back to this roster. We're going to have Mike Evans on the field, of course. And then the Buccaneers went out and spent a first round draft pick on Emeka Egbuka, one of the very best wide receivers in the 2025 rookie draft class. So the assumption here is that he's going to be pushed back on this roster a bit. That also includes tight end Cade Otton and 2 very good running backs in Bucky Irving and Rashod White, who can also take away volume in the passing game. So his ADP definitely makes sense on paper. But I think when you're looking late in your drafts, if you need to kind of throw a dart on the wall at the wide receiver position in terms of depth and redraft formats, or there's always an argument for another wide receiver in best ball drafts. I think Jaylen McDaniel could certainly still be a wide receiver at times who has a role in this offense that's going to throw the football a lot, that's going to see the red zone more in 2025. I think this is one of the best offenses on paper going into the season. But outside of that, we still have 2 veteran wide receivers atop of this depth chart. And when I say 2 veteran wide receivers, Mike Evans is currently age 31, who dealt with a hamstring injury last year, and Chris Godwin is age 29, who dealt with an extremely serious knee injury last year. And then we've got a rookie wide receiver, and don't get me wrong, I'm a huge fan of Egbuka, but at the end of the day, this is still a rookie wide receiver. You never know exactly what you're going to get right off of the bat. There is still certainly a world where Jaylen McDaniel has a role at times in this offense throughout the year. And on top of that, there's definitely still, cross her fingers that it doesn't happen, but definitely still the chance that Mike Evans or Chris Godwin late in their career deal with some sort of injury this year, even if it's not a serious injury, even if they just miss some time. That is where Jaylen McDaniel definitely has value in best ball formats, but once again, I think still has some value when it comes to redraft as well. So we're looking late. We're making a lot of assumptions here and there throughout this video, but I think if we're looking at a player who you don't have to spend hardly any draft capital whatsoever on, Jaylen McDaniel could be a player who ends up surprising us at times throughout the 2025 fantasy football season. Let's take a look at another under the radar wide receiver, and that is Rashod Bateman of the Baltimore Ravens, who finished last year averaging 10.3 fantasy points per game, had 756 receiving yards off of 45 catches, 16.8 yards per catch, and 9 receiving touchdowns. This is also a player who just signed a 3-year extension with the Ravens. And I think some people might look at this roster and look at the addition of DeAndre Hopkins in the offseason via free agency as like Hopkins is the wide receiver too. I know not everyone looks at it that way, and that is not the way we should be looking at it. It's Zay Flowers, it's Rashod Bateman, and then it's DeAndre Hopkins, if not somebody else. I mean, Hopkins is a veteran presence that they are bringing in. He is age 33. Bateman's age 25, just signed a new contract, and he's going to have a role in this offense just like he did last year. Bateman was a player I talked a lot about last year as like a last-minute plug-and-play, a waiver wire guy at times, a player that you might have sitting on your bench that you can definitely throw in the flex. And while it was a bit inconsistent, we got a lot of double-digit fantasy performances out of Rashod Bateman in 2024. There's a lot of talk against Mark Andrews right now. Don't get me wrong. If Mark Andrews is traded or has a down season, I mean, last year he really, when we statistically look at it, mostly for the majority in terms of fantasy points scored, relied on touchdowns. Obviously, if any of these things, negative about Mark Andrews are true this year, that would mean an increase for Isaiah Likely at the tight end position, but it could definitely also mean an increase in terms of targets and or receptions for Rashod Bateman in 2025. If you look at the first 3 seasons of Rashod Bateman's career, very disappointing because this was a player who had a lot of high expectations and essentially did nothing, especially for fantasy football, the first 3 years of his year. And last year, I mean, he was only the wide receiver 40, but once again was an undrafted player for the most part, or you got him off the waiver wire, whatever it may be. And kind of came through in terms of what he was actually able to put together last year. So I like where Bateman is currently going in drafts with an ADP of 160.2 on Sleeper and going as late as the 10th round in Underdog Fantasy as well. As a player, we're not spending a lot of draft capital on who could have a lot of upside going into the 2025 season. This is arguably my favorite deep sleeper as we approach the fantasy year. All right, it's about to get real gross because we are talking Javante Williams, running back for the Dallas Cowboys. Yeah, I know. Bring on the hate comments. This is the RB 29, 2023, the RB 30 last year. Okay, age 25, added to the Cowboys offense via free agency, an ADP of 106.7 on the Sleeper app, and then on Underdog is going as late as the end of the 11th round. So we look at the makeup of this roster for the Cowboys. Jaylen Blue, rookie out of Texas, has, kind of all the buzz, all the upside. Some people even like Phil Maffa, the other rookie out of Clemson. And then we do have Miles Sanders hanging around as well. So Javante Williams definitely gets pushed back in drafts for that reason, because people are willing to wait and target Jaylen Blue, which I'm okay with, especially in like best ball formats. But I think that some people are going to end up a little bit disappointed, and where you might end up starting the season with Javante Williams as the running back who gets the bulk of the carries. This is something that happens a lot in the offseason. A rookie is drafted, or maybe another option of free agency is added, and there's kind of this like boring, gross, just bland, flatline player on the roster, and everyone's like, he's going to be dust by the beginning of week 1 or whatever. And then that player comes out and has like 10, 11 fantasy points week 1, and they are getting the bulk of the touches for at least the beginning of the season, sometimes the rest of the season, right? So listen, I think that the Cowboys roster offensively is pretty good in terms of, what they're going to be able to do through the air. Offensive line's relatively shaky. Defense, not great, but they do have CeeDee Lamb, George Pickens, and then 2 good tight ends in Ferguson and Shoemaker, and we're going to get a healthy Dak Prescott this year, presumably at least. So that just leaves this hole at running back. And like I said, Jaylen Blue is who I've seen most of you guys try to target, which I'm completely okay with. But I do think that Javante Williams will have a role on this roster. Do I think you should go out of your way to draft Javante Williams? No, this is not a player that I want to be leaving like a ton of drafts with, but in the right circumstances, based on the makeup of your roster and or strategy, I think that Javante Williams will end up having a role with the Cowboys. Call me crazy. We'll see what happens week 1, but this is a player who I do think could end up being a deep sleeper who actually will gain more and more draft capital, slight draft capital at least, as the offseason progresses. All right, I got a real gross one for you guys. That is Kareem Hunt of the Kansas City Chiefs. This is more of a best ball pick for me. He sits at an ADP of 204.9 on the Sleeper app. When we look on Underdog, a lot of times he doesn't even get drafted. If there's 20 rounds in an Underdog draft, he's usually off the board, but in 18-round Underdog drafts, he doesn't always even get drafted. But I want to take a look at Kareem Hunt. I do expect Isaiah Pacheco to be a lot better in 2025. He started off last year through the first 2 weeks great and then got injured. Opened up things for Kareem Hunt, especially after we saw Carson Steele do essentially nothing. And I don't know. I think that Pacheco's still the guy here, but there could definitely be moments where Kareem Hunt, who the Chiefs kind of went out of their way to re-sign to a one-year deal, is still involved in this offense. He averaged 12 fantasy points per game. Look at games last year where Kareem Hunt started for the Chiefs. He had double-digit fantasy points in all of them except for 5. So I think he could easily still be a part of this offense. But I get it, right? Isaiah Pacheco probably going to be healthy this year. Some guys taking looks at rookie Rashod Smith out of SMU as well as another option for the Chiefs. And then they did go out and sign Elijah Mitchell as well. So the writing on the wall here is not fantastic. But if you need to take an absolute dart throw, especially in best ball formats at a running back, maybe you just went 0 running back, building a different type of team, whatever it may be. Maybe you drafted Pacheco and Mitchell and Smith are gone in your draft, whatever it is. Kareem Hunt is a player who I think could at least have some sort of role, maybe a red zone role with the Chiefs in 2025. So I warned you guys, some of these picks are going to be gross. These 2 running back picks were definitely gross, but I have found myself in certain circumstances in 20-round best ball drafts, at least walking away with some shares of Kareem Hunt. I want to give you guys one quarterback, and let's talk about Tua Tagovailoa, who's currently sitting at an ADP of 169.5 on Sleeper. And he goes as late as the 13th round on Underdog Fantasy. So right now, I mean, we've got Tua going after quarterbacks like J.J. McCarthy, Trevor Lawrence, Cam Ward, Matthew Stafford, and Michael Penix, and being drafted before guys like Anthony Richardson and Bryce Young, if we're looking at, current rankings on Sleeper. And for me, I mean, Tua obviously was disappointing last year because he got injured early, but week 1, he was fine, 18.6 fantasy points, and he got, the scary concussion in week 2, so we're going to X out that game. Then he missed a couple weeks, but it did take a little bit of time for Tua to get going, about 3 weeks, and then he was a very good fantasy quarterback for a couple weeks there. But between weeks 11 and week 14, Tua had 23 or more fantasy points in all of those games before being a little bit disappointing to wrap up the year and then missing week 17. Nonetheless, we are not that far removed from Tua Tagovailoa being the quarterback 9 in 2023 and the quarterback 15 in 2022. And we're also not that far removed from the Dolphins being one of the very best fantasy offenses in all of fantasy football, and everybody wanting as many pieces of the Dolphins as possible. Right now, we look at this roster, right? I mean, Tua, Devon Achane, a couple mentionable running backs behind Achane, Tyreek Hill, which I get everyone's against Tyreek Hill right now, Jalen Waddle, Nick Westbrook-Ikini, a player that I like, and then Johnny Smith, as long as he doesn't get traded, which I don't think the Dolphins are personally going to trade Johnny Smith. I mean, we have plenty of playmakers around Tua, and I just think he's being a little bit overlooked in fantasy drafts right now. So if you absolutely kick the can at quarterback, or maybe you're going with a quarterback who is a little bit more injury risk, you need to take a late round guy, or when you're building stacks when it comes to best ball, I think that the Dolphins stacks right now between Hill, Waddle, and Tua are relatively cheap. So I think that Tua is a player that we can end up targeting, and I don't think you guys are going to be crazy disappointed. And if Tua ends up being not drafted in your leagues, is on the waiver wire to start this season, I think this is a player that we want to keep a close eye on. I mean, he still averaged 17 fantasy points per game last year, which is not great in terms of upside. We kind of want to be closer to that 20 points per game mark, but ultimately, that is actually better than what he averaged in 2023 when he had 16.7 fantasy points per game. He had 18.4 fantasy points per game in 2022. So if you're in those late rounds of your 2025 fantasy football drafts, I think that Tua is absolutely a quarterback that you guys can keep a close eye on. All right, let's wrap it up with one of my favorite sleeper tight ends going into 2025. One of my favorite sleepers overall. That is Brenton Strange of the Jacksonville Jaguars, who's a player who was one of my favorite waiver wire plays last year as well, sitting at an ADP of 199.8 on the Sleeper app. And this is a player who is going late in underdog drafts as well. This is a player who I also have heard a lot of people talk about And I don't know. I actually expected his ADP to maybe move up a little bit. We're still relatively early in the offseason. Don't get me wrong. But I've definitely heard a lot of you guys mention Brenton Strange in streams and stuff like that. We look at this offense. We look at this roster, right? We're going to get a healthy Trevor Lawrence this year. The running back room's interesting. Bashaw Tootin probably going to take it over, but we'll probably get a little bit of ETN, a little bit of Bigsby here and there as well. And we look at the wide receivers. I mean, Brian Thomas Jr., Travis Hunter, Parker Washington, Dewami Brown. Those are going to be the guys who I would definitely assume, at least between the first two, get the bulk of the passing attack. But we've seen Trevor Lawrence like to target the tight end position with what we saw between him and Evan Ingram, at least in 2023 and 2022. And right now, we look at the tight ends on this team. We got guys like Quentin Morris, Johnny Munt behind Brenton Strange. But those are guys who are really here in terms of the pass blocking ability, while Brenton Strange is the guy on the roster who has that pass catching ability. And, we've seen their GM, James Gladstone, come out and make, some very positive comments about Brenton Strange being a big part of the passing attack this year. We'll see what happens. And then, I have kind of heard the argument that new head coach Liam Cohen, who was the offensive coordinator for the Bucs last year, like I've heard the comparison, like Cade Otton had his best season last year with Liam Cohen as offensive coordinator. Now Liam Cohen's the head coach for the Jaguars. I think that's an okay argument, but also we have to look at a lot of the games where Cade Otton was like balling out, were games where Mike Evans and Chris Godwin both missed time. So I think that's a little bit shaky, but it is nice to see that Liam Cohen does know how to utilize the tight end position. But ultimately, like I said, Trevor Lawrence, I think will build a good chemistry with Brenton Strange. It is still encouraging that Liam Cohen knows how to play to the strengths of different players here. And while there is obviously going to be the most volume to Brian Thomas Jr. and Travis Hunter, presumably on this team, I think that there's definitely the case for Brenton Strange to be the next player on this team who gets the most volume in the passing game. And he's essentially free in fantasy football drafts right now. So if you're absolutely at the end of your draft and you're like, oh, I forgot to draft a tight end, or you need to help solidify your tight end room, you're Frankensteining it together, I think Brenton Strange is 110% worth the selection. This is a player that I have found myself leaving a lot of fantasy football drafts with currently. And I think this is a player who is absolutely one of my favorite deep sleepers as we approach the 2025 fantasy football season. And that'll do it for today's video. There are some deep sleepers for you guys as we approach the 2025 fantasy football season. If you guys are new to the channel, this is all we do here all year long, free redraft, dynasty, and best ball content. If you guys are into that, be sure to hit that subscribe button on the way out. And of course, if you guys have any fantasy football questions whatsoever, drop me a comment down below. I'll get back to each and every comment on this video. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.